Without further ado, we have Dr. Frank Fish here with us today. He received his BA from SUNY at Oswego and both his master's and PhD from Michigan State University. His research focused on the energetics and hydrodynamics of vertebrate swimming with particular regard to propulsive modes and the evolution of aquatic mammals. This research is accomplished by examining morphological structures with computer tomography, CT scans, biomechanics with motion analysis and computer digitizing, and exercise physiology by measurement of metabolic performance with oxygen consumption. And then also I want to note that Dr. Frank Fish recently won the Ig Nobel Prize, which is sort of an exciting award. It's real science that sounds funny. And specifically, he got his award for researching why ducks line up in single file. So very cool stuff, and I'll be excited to hear the rest of your talk. Without further ado, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Glad to be here. I guess here is in my office, and you're wherever. So what I want to talk today about is some biomimicry that we use in technologies based on marine fauna. Just to show you, I have experience with various charismatic animals. This was actually done at the University of Santa Cruz. And I do work on things such as elephant seals and looking at their locomotion, as well as also swimming and variety of animals. And at times have to put myself into some degree of danger. We can, where I'll actually come into the frame in a little bit and get close to these fighting elephant seals. So right there, and then move out of the way just in time as they then back up and they start taking notice of me. But what I want to talk about here is biomimicry. Okay, and what we're attempting to do in biomimicry is to take what we learn from biological organisms and integrate them into modern technologies. So probably the best of the biomimicry types of inventions that you know about is Velcro. It was based upon the burrs that a Swiss scientist found in his dog when he took it out into the field, and of course developed a whole new industry. And there have been a variety of, of different products that have been done. Some of my work is shown at the very bottom here, where we're trying to find an alternative to standard screw propellers, and we can get into that in a bit. Biomimicry actually goes back quite a ways. You go back to Da Vinci. Da Vinci actually looked at fish in a river, and he wanted to be a military architect. And so he invented a new projectile instead of a cannonball that could go faster and fly further, based upon what he learned from fish. Borelli in the 1600s envisioned a submarine that used oars based upon frog feet and swim bladders of fish in order to control buoyancy. And then Cayley in 1800 envisioned an airplane with a fuselage that was based on a body of least resistance, that being a dolphin. So all these ideas have been around, they just haven't been articulated as biomimicry. And where I come in is in looking at something like this. This is General Dynamics Knifefish, what's called an autonomous underwater vehicle. It's a mine hunter. And what we have there is essentially a torpedo that moves fairly slowly. It goes for a long time and it's a lot of cost. And we want to see whether we can improve upon this autonomous underwater vehicle with a biological or biomimetic autonomous underwater vehicle. And so that's what I'm really trying to do, is to, invent that next generation of autonomous or robotic systems that we can put into the water and have move around on their own. Now, there are various naval requirements that are being looked at for trying to build that next generation of AUV. One is speed. And if we look at various marine organisms, Swordfish, sailfish go about close to 80 miles an hour. Even tuna are up around 46 miles per hour. Dolphins around 31. And even sea lions, which are very prevalent around Moss Landing, are moving at about 12 miles per hour, which is fairly fast if you're in the water. Another requirement is maneuverability, that ability to turn very rapidly. And so we look at things like sea lions, which have incredible turning ability, but even something like a humpback whale, which I'll come back to later, has that ability to form bubble nets and move in tight circles. So these are animals we want to look at, as well as fish, which things like angelfish have a shape that essentially allows them to be more maneuverable than something like a tuna. Okay. We can see the importance of this with this graph here. Here we have length and we have the turning rate, that is in degrees per second. And if you look at standard autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, they're the black symbols at the bottom, turning rate very poor. Even if we go to some of the new biomimetic AUVs, which are in red, they still don't match the capabilities of real animals, which is something we'd like to build in. Another requirement is efficiency. Okay, these AUVs have a certain battery life and they have to be able to extend that operation. So we want something that is fairly efficient. And again, we have cost, if we look at cost of transport, what we find is that the cost of transport for animals, including marine mammals, is actually quite low. The lowest is actually for fish, which is that black line in the right-hand graph. But if we look at some of the AUVs that are out there, they have higher costs of transport. They're not as efficient as the actual animals themselves. Another consideration is stealth. We want something that's quiet, that doesn't cavitate like a propeller does, that has a very narrow wake rather than a nice broad wake, as you might see on a boat, something that can actually hide on the bottom if need be, like rays, which cover themselves with sand, or even blend in like the sea turtle. Okay, all of these are another thing that we'd like to look at. Littoral operation. AUVs currently operate in open water. Okay, but what the Navy would like to see is something that works in that high energy environment where there's a lot of wave energy and such, and be able to deal with that without being tossed around. And then we have to consider scaling. We want something that's not really small. We can get very maneuverable biomimetic AUVs, but they're tiny. So there's very little that you can do with them. We want something that's much bigger, maybe not the size of a whale or even a large elephant seal, but something in between that we can utilize and will deal with the various forces, some of which I've already mentioned. And that has to have sensory capabilities. Okay, so animals have various sensing capabilities. Internally, we have proprioceptors that tell us when our muscles are contracting and how much force is on tendons. Okay, seal whiskers are made so that they reduce the amount of noise from the turbulence that they produce, and as a result, they are better at detecting signals. The nose of sharks can detect various odors, and then we even have things like echolocation that we find in dolphins. We're also looking at something that will be amphibious, that will move from water onto land, as do sea turtles and also seals and sea lions. And then we want to consider depth. Recently, a group of Chinese were actually able to send a soft robotic biomimetic robot down to the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the deepest part of the ocean. Although marine mammals don't dive that deep, okay, we do have some that dive very deep in the water, such as beaked whales. So we want something that can operate at any particular depth that we would like to investigate. So all these are potential requirements that we would like to build in that many of the animals that I've mentioned have the ability already to deal with. Now, what we want to do, and what my research has been, is to look at certain species for certain types of attributes. All of those things that I listed as naval requirements can't be met by a single biomimetic AUV, but depending upon the mission, we can have particular autonomous robots based upon animals that can do particular types of missions. Okay, so I want to mention 5 particular animals that have been the focus of my research: the sea lion, the sea turtle, the manta ray, tuna, and the humpback whale. So let's start off with the sea lion. And what we're doing here is building an autonomous underwater vehicle based upon the sea lion that will be able to swim in water, maneuver tightly, and also be amphibious, move on to the land. So one of the things we do is first study sea lions, and we look at their morphology. Those images that you see on the left bottom of this slide were made from taking multiple videos of sea lions as they were gliding along. This work was actually done at Moss Landing, okay, at the Sluice facility. We had 2 animals there that we had trained to just swim around and then go through this field of view that overlap between 5 video cameras. And we were then able to build a 3-dimensional model of the 2 animals. But this is going to go into our sea lion and how help it in the way it's going to maneuver. So here we have the start of our robotic sea lion. Okay, it looks sort of like a sea lion. Okay, it has multiple components to it, multiple parts. It has the flippers, the hind flippers, as well as the actual 4 flippers that they use for propulsion and swimming. And so it's envisioned that what we'll have is a sea lion that can move around, and we'll build this robot and then be able to maneuver once we get it into the water. We're still at our early stage here, but we are capable of producing the type of swimming motions that the sea lions do. The terrestrial locomotion will come later. Another particular animal is that robotic turtle. Okay, so here what we're doing is we're creating something that functions and swims like a sea turtle, but then moves on land like a large tortoise. And so we have ART, the amphibious robotic turtle. Okay, and this is done with an engineer, Rebecca Kramer, at Yale University. And so what we have here is a soft robotic limb that can morph from a flipper for swimming into a leg for walking around. So here we can see some motions of this robot while it's swimming. And because we have 4 sets of flippers, we can actually have this swim maybe like a plesiosaur that occurred during the Mesozoic. And we can have it walk. Okay, you'll notice we're sort of cheating a little here. We've speeded up the video, but we are working on that to get it to move a bit faster and be stable in the way that it walks. Now, I said that efficiency is important, and so we've been measuring the efficiency of the robot by looking at cost of transport. The circle on the graph there shows what real sea turtles can do in their swimming, but ART, for crawling and walking, is rather high compared to how much animals actually expend energetically when they're walking, and definitely for swimming, we're much too high. But the research is continuing, and eventually we hope to get this all down. Now, one animal that's particularly been fascinating is the manta ray. And because of working with the manta, I've had the opportunity to go scuba diving in Micronesia, to go film mantas, as you see here. But then we can build a robotic manta. So here we flap those fins using what's called a tensegrity structure. And this was built by Hilary Bart Smith at the University of Virginia in a project that I worked with her. And so by having this linkage where we have these beams that then have sort of tendons or cords that can then pull on this entire structure, we can get this fin to move up and down. Now, eventually we can get a more autonomous system. And so here is MantaBot, and it's capable of swimming around in a pool. It can maneuver very tightly. And the picture on the left-hand side at the bottom shows MantaBot, and just compare the circles that they can turn in. And you can see it's better than a manta ray, which is bigger, and better than Remus, which is sort of our workhorse autonomous underwater vehicle. And we can do things with this. We can change its depth. We can swim around, swims at about 1 body length a second, okay? And fairly quickly, and doesn't cost that much either. So this is a nice, stable system. Now, we've also been investigating tuna. And so a lot of work has gone into this, again, with Hilary Bart Smith, as well as a number of other people, developed the TunaBot. And so here we have a robotic system that can swim around at a fairly high speed, which is, again, one of the requirements that the Navy would like. And so by wagging its tail in the way that a tuna does, we can actually get it to swim fairly quickly. Not as fast as a real tuna, but again, we're working on that by changing the stiffness in the peduncle region and the caudal fin. We can actually get more efficiency out of it and make it swim faster. And we can look then also at ways to make it turn. So here a tuna, this was shot at the Hopkins Marine Station in Monterey. And so we look at how tuna can turn and how fast they can do it. And we're again trying to emulate that sort of level of performance. So, as I said, here are all these naval requirements. What we'd like to do is to build something with all these requirements in them. The thing is, we just can't, okay? They're too different. For speed, we may not get maneuverability, and we may not have high efficiency or even stealth. But if we want speed and we want operation in the littoral environment, maybe we forgo some of these other things. Everything is really mission dependent, okay? So we can build particular organisms that will emulate the performance of those organisms and use it for particular missions, whether we want to dive deeply, whether we want something that's amphibious, whether we want something that's large or small, whether we want it to operate in the littoral environment, and so on. Okay. So it's all going to depend on what sort of mission, what the best organism to use it. But we've been investigating various lines of inquiry and different animals with different abilities. Now, rather than building a robotic system, we can look at the integration of a morphology and combine that into technologies. And a good example of this is something that I've worked on for some time, and that's the humpback whale. Humpback whale is Megaptera nova engeli, species name, which means giant wing of New England. And the reason it gets that name is because of those enormous flippers that it has. Those flippers are 1/3 the body length of the whale. And so they use this in their swimming. Okay. You'll also notice something interesting about the flipper in that it has a wing-like appearance, but unlike the wings of an airplane that you might fly in and get the cheap seats right over the wings and stare out at them, they're not smooth, they're bumpy. We have these bumps. And so the question is, what's happening? What is the whale doing with these bumps? And what might it mean to advancing technology? Well, I got the opportunity a long time ago in which a whale died in New Jersey. And I asked for one of the flippers that I could bring back to my lab and investigate. And here were these flippers. They were enormous. Supposedly, the flippers were supposed to be smaller based upon the length of the whale. When they measured it, they said it was 20 feet. So 1/3 of 20 feet, it's about 6 feet or so. Okay, not too bad. I could get it into my little car. When I got there, I found these enormous 10-foot long flippers that weigh several hundreds pounds. And I asked what happened, and they said they mismeasured the whale. And I then proceeded to cut these flippers into 3 sections, each one over 100 pounds apiece, and throw it in the trunk of my car, which was a little Mercury Lynx, like a Ford Escort. Watch the whole rear end of the car go down, and then hope that I could get back to Pennsylvania before a New Jersey state trooper caught me. But finding rotting body parts in the trunk of a car wrapped in black plastic is no big deal in New Jersey. So I got it back, and then with the help of a student shown here, Jan Battle, we then were able to section these flippers and investigate their morphology along with those strange bumps. So if we take a look at the flipper, I said it has a wing-like appearance, and when you cut through it, you actually see a sort of symmetrical wing. And then we do see those bumps along the leading edge of that wing-like structure. Now, it's interesting, when you look at the humpback whale flipper, it actually is just an enormous hand with the bones also of an arm, but the main length of it is all a hand, just like, and the same bones that we find in our own hand, minus the thumb, are found in the humpback whale flipper. What's also interesting is those bumps, and those bumps coincide with where we have knuckles or joints on the bones. And so we have about 10 or 11 of these bumps along the leading edge. Now, to show you how important this flipper is, this is a fetus of a humpback whale. It's about 1 foot long. It was at the Smithsonian. And even at that small size compared to what will eventually be a 60-foot long whale, okay, it has already developed that flipper and those bumps along its leading edge. So they're really important even in the development of this organism. Now, what's the whale doing with these enormous flippers? Well, they maneuver with them. They are the most acrobatic and aquabatic of all the large whales. They can maneuver tightly and do it fairly rapidly, and they use those large flippers for that function. They also use them to catch their prey. They can make these bubble nets in which they swim around and make tighter and tighter circles. And they use the flippers to make those turns so that they can corral prey and then engulf them. If we look at the flipper itself, we find that those bumps along the flipper are positioned at different distances. We call the bumps tubercles, and we can see how they're distributed on a flipper as a proportion of span. And we find that over about 40% of the span of the flipper, those bumps, those tubercles, are positioned about 7 to 9% of the span. So they're fairly regular in their distribution. And to me, that indicated that there's something hydrodynamic going on here. So at this point, I'm a biologist, and trying to investigate the hydrodynamics was a little beyond me. So I got involved with engineers and started reading their literature. Now, this was a report done by someone at Notre Dame and also the University in London. And what they did is they bent up a cylinder. Okay, and you can see that on the right-hand side at the very top, a bent cylinder. Now, normally, when you introduce a flow to just a straight cylinder, as on the upper left image, you get these vortices that come off alternately. It forms what we call a vortex street. But when you bend that cylinder, what happens is where you have a trough, you get vortices coming off in a fairly wide wake. But where you have the bump facing into the flow, you get a very narrow wake, okay, as is shown on the bottom left. Okay, so the bumps are changing the flow. But what does this mean for something that like a wing? Well, for that, I got involved with an engineer, Lawrence Howell at Duke University, and what he did is he built a model of the humpback whale flipper, a more perfect than perfect flipper. And we took that to the US Naval Academy, where two people there, Mark Murray and Dave Milosevic, tested it in their wind tunnel. They tested the modified flipper with the bumps and another flipper without the bumps. And this is what they found. If you increase the angle of attack, that is the angle of our flipper to the flow coming in, there's really no difference between the tubercled flipper and the one without the tubercles. For most of the angles, as you increase them, until you get to about 11 degrees. And there, we start to see that the baseline flipper, the one without the tubercles, all of a sudden lift falls off, what we call stall. But the tubercled flippers keep going, so we get an increase in lift. And then when it does stall, it's not as dramatic. So there doesn't appear to be any difference, at least initially, in the lift, but what we get is a delay in stall and a slight increase in lift at higher angles of attack. Well, people would say, well, you don't get something for nothing, so there's got to be a disadvantage here. What about drag, the resistance to forward motion? Well, again, at low angles of attack, there's no difference between the two flippers until we get to that stall point for our flipper without the tubercles. And then the drag really goes up. But the tubercle flipper, because it's not stalling, the drag stays down. So we have a situation in which it's sort of a win-win-win. We get an increase in lift, a delay in stall, and drag remains low compared to a wing without the tubercles. Now, other work was done by other labs, and they found that depending upon how you structured the tubercles, how many you had on your wing, or how big they were, you could get differences in performance. But what you can see is that there's really no stall with the tubercles as compared to our baseline, which stalls rather dramatically. Now, how does the magic happen? Okay, so here's two wings, one with tubercles, one without. Now look at the one without. If we increase its angle, excuse me. Sorry, I've had a cold. If we increase the angle of attack to, let's say, 10 degrees, what happens is we start to get separation. That is, the air or water starts to move off from the surface of our wing. And you can see that as the gray turbulence at the on our wing. If we increase the angle of attack more, that turbulence will move up closer to the front of the wing and the wing will stall out. Well, with our tubercle wing, what happens here is that the fluid that goes into the trough between the tubercles forms these paired vortices. And although they're separating from the surface of the wing, what they do is they help the flow over the tubercles and they keep it attached all the way to the trailing edge and thus delay stall. So here's some ways we can look at it. There are the paired vortices, and then you can see sandwiched between them the flow coming over the tubercle itself. Think of it this way. It's like a baseball pitching machine. We have two counter-rotating wheels, and then the ball goes between them, and then they propel and accelerate the ball out. The same thing is happening here. Because of the direction of the spin of these vortices, they accelerate the flow of, the flow over the tubercle and keep it from stalling. We also find that because we have a three-dimensional wing, we get what's called a tip vortex. And tip vortices are important, and you see them in the contrails of planes. But with the tubercles, we reduce that tip vortex, and that has certain advantages to it. What the tubercles do is become like aerodynamic fences. They prevent the flow from moving towards the wingtip. They thus make the flow more two-dimensional. They reduce that tip vortex, and as a result, they reduce a special type of drag associated with that vortex called induced drag. And they also reduce the noise. So the noise you hear in a fan or a propeller is really due to the tip vortex that's being shed from that fan or propeller. In fact, the tubercles have been tested, and it's been found that they can actually reduce noise in things like jet engines. So again, by reducing these tip vortices, by changing the flow patterns, we can actually get noise reduction. Now, I'm interested as a biologist in what are the tubercles doing for the whale, okay? It's one thing that's talk about lift and drag, but these whales aren't flying. So why do they need to have these tubercles? Well, they tested the design of the tubercles and the humpback whale flipper based on a real whale flipper at Brigham Young University. And they compared it to a smooth and filtered sort of wing-like flipper. And what they found was the original with the tubercles outperformed the others. It didn't stall. The lift remained high, and in fact, it was higher than the other two without the tubercles. So what does that mean for the whale? Well, it means that the whale can get the benefit of that flow change over the tubercles on its flippers. So what? The whale isn't flying, but it is turning, and it uses those flippers and the lift created to turn. And thus, the smaller the turn, the more food the animal can corral and catch. To do that, they have to operate at high angles of attack, where normal flippers would stall out. You can think of it this way. For those of you familiar with snow and ice, we use the lift in order to turn the animal, okay? But it's like going on a road and following the curve of a road. But imagine that road is covered by ice and snow, okay? if you lose lift, what's happening, it's like going into a turn on ice and snow and not being able to follow the turn. You go out if the flipper should stall. And in this case, if you're in a car, you go out and you're in the ditch because you go off in a straight line rather than following the curve. So the tubercles are important then in allowing these animals to make these very tight turning maneuvers in order to catch their prey. Now, what can we do with all of this? Okay, well, we can create wing-like shapes that we can apply in technologies. So we can take any sort of wing, we can put tubercles on it, we can change the position of the tubercles, the size of the tubercles, their location. We can put it onto fat wings, thin wings, and get various benefits. So you're in California, and I'm sure many of you surf, particularly shortboard surfers, and one of the things that you'll do are cutbacks. To do that little maneuver, what you have to do is you have to make a very tight turn. For that, you have your skeg or your fin, and if you should lose lift, and that's what you have there, you have a wing, and the wing is producing lift to make that turn. If you lose that lift and it stalls, you're going to wipe out. But with the tubercles, you can make a very tight turn. And so we see that people have applied them to surfboard fins. Also, there's a company that has put it onto a hydrofoil, so you can surf out of the water, so to speak, and sort of fly. If you're a swimmer, okay, you can have devices that help you swim. So pictured there on the left is Lawrence Howell, and he's got a device there with a wing with tubercles on it, and you apply that to your legs and you pump it and you can swim a little bit more effortlessly. But Speedo has produced swim fins using the tubercles based upon the humpback whales, and also swim paddles. So you can get a potential boost there. If you're a kayaker, some people have applied the humpback whale tubercles to kayak paddles in order to potentially get a more efficient stroke. Sailing, if you're a yachtsman, okay, you jibe and tack and do all those sort of nautical things, you make tight turns. And if your rudder can't make the turn, if it loses lift, okay, you're not going to be able to make a tight turn. So we can put tubercles on rudders and center boards, okay, keels, in order to have sailboats perform better. And there's actually a person I met who's in Santa Cruz who actually did put tubercles on his rudder of a sailboat. This person has a device called a quadrofoil. It's essentially a personal hydrofoil, and the hydrofoil blades have the tubercles on them. Or if you've gone up to places like Wisconsin and go ice boating, where you can go very fast on these runners on flat ice on lakes, this one person put the tubercles on the mast. The sail itself is just a large wing. And so with it, he hoped to reduce the amount of drag and go even faster than other competitors. Of course, you might think that a great place for the tubercles would be on a submarine. Submarines have all these various appendages, these wing-like structures, dive planes and rudders. Why not put tubercles on them? Well, the Navy has not, at least to my knowledge, actually incorporated tubercles onto these structures, but a group in New Jersey, actually a bunch of high school students at a technical high school, they entered the human-powered submarine races that are held every year, every 2 years. and they put the tubercles on their rudder and their dive planes. And the way this works is that the submarine floods, there's a motorman who pedals, and a pilot who has to follow a string of lights underwater. Sorry. And they're both on scuba. And they test this at the David Taylor Naval Test Basin in Bethesda, Maryland, just outside DC. It's a big facility. And in fact, it's really dark down there. So here's his team. Okay. And their teacher was a submarine officer. He's going to check the pilot in the front there. Pilot has to look through a little window and follow some lights. Once they tell you to go, the motorman starts pedaling away. And they follow that string of lights. And you can see this was a bad run because they lost a string of lights and ended up crashing the sub into the wall of the pool. But they carried on, did it again. There was another attempt. Unfortunately, they hit the bottom, and by the rules, they're disqualified on that run. But then they finally got a good run. And here it is. But the tubercles then were useful in allowing the sub to maneuver. Other places in terrestrial transportation, a group of German students decided that they could put tubercles onto the mirrors of trucks and reduce the drag on the truck. Or tubercles went onto a race car, a McLaren, and they attempted to try it there. It was put onto bicycles, on the wheels, and even on bike frames. Aircraft engine ducts could use tubercles to help stabilize the flow. If you have, sorry, hold on just a second. If you have several millions, probably tens of millions of dollars, you can buy this Biomimetic yacht, which has stabilizers with tubercles on it. And of course, airplanes could utilize tubercles. So we could have jet planes with tubercles. The advantage is it would be hard to stall. So it would be harder for the plane to sort of fall out of the sky. But additionally, you potentially can get rid of all those slots and flaps and all the machinery that goes with it to keep from stalling those wings and thus allow the plane to fly, and thus either have more fuel for longer flights or make the plane safer, okay, and also reduce the weight of the plane so it'll make it more economical to fly. Here's one that we just found out about. Someone put it onto paragliders. And so the leading edge of these paragliders has the tubercle, and it makes it more stable. This is the weird one, putting tubercles on the wings of drones that would go into other planets to then look at their atmospheres. We could put it on propellers. Even there's been a test for one of these whirligig types of things that you can build yourself, or we can put it on helicopter rotor blades or fans. And there's a company in Canada that did actually produce these fans. They found that there was 25% energy savings. They reduced heating costs, and they were 75% quieter. We can put them on computer fans, tidal turbines, and we could put it onto regular windmills. and get more power out of the windmill. And in fact, sorry, the company Whale Power, which I'm happen to be president of, actually found that we could get 20% greater power out of a given amount of wind compared to the same blades, but without the tubercles. So it is possible then to learn from biology and to then integrate that into technologies, whether it's in the creation of AUVs or windmills or any other particular technology that you want to improve. But what I'd like to end with is a little conservation note. When I came up with the idea of looking at the tubercles, that's because I had walked into a store in Quincy Market in Boston where they had animal art, and they had this little figurine of a humpback whale. And I looked at it and I said, the artist got it wrong. He put these bumps on the leading edge. And I found out later that no, he had actually got it right. And I became very obsessed with trying to find out what these tubercles were and why they worked. We now know that there are potential applications from this tubercle technology. Now, if the artist hadn't seen a humpback whale, he might never have done that particular little statue that brought me to investigate how that flipper and the tubercles worked. At the beginning of the 1900s, humpback whales were down to 10% of their population. They could have potentially gone extinct. We don't know where the next great innovation is going to come from. And there's a treasure chest of things that we can learn from various animals, plants, and other organisms on this planet that we can then utilize. But they are under constant threat, whether it's manta rays, dolphins, sea lions, or whales. So it's up to us to really try and conserve these organisms because they may lead to ways of bettering our technology, overcoming problems like global climate change that threaten us as well as themselves. So we need to conserve them and protect not only them, but the ocean environment in general. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk, Frank. I really enjoyed that. Oh yeah, thank you. And I'll see hands.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, I have a question for you, actually. I didn't get a chance to tell you this, but I'm actually a bit of a paleontologist and have been working on the Mesozoic. So you mentioning the plesiosaur was very interesting. I had thought, they have two hydrofoils, but I had been told that if they flap together, they interfere with one another. So I was kind of an off-topic question, but I was wondering, you said you could make the turtle fly like a plesiosaur. So I was just wondering, how you decided what their flipper movement was and then, what it looks like.
That's an area of debate. We don't know how plesiosaurs synchronize their flippers. Whether the fore flippers and the hind flippers were moving in the same direction simultaneously, or they were 180 degrees out of phase, or whether they were using some sort of synchronization that the hind flippers could catch the vorticity generated by the fore flippers. We don't know, but it may be possible we can test various ideas of synchronization with a robotic system. So there may be use that way.
Yeah. Have you tried that with the turtle? I know your focus is elsewhere, so perhaps not.
At this point, we're just trying to optimize the swimming gait as well as the terrestrial gait. And then probably once we've established that, we can go off and try and start to do experiments on coordination of the flippers.
Awesome. See, I'm not seeing anything. Oh, I do have one question in the audience, and we have the speaker coming around for you.
Thank you. The fantastic talk. I also had a turtle related question.
Okay.
which is that what are the advantages of a sea turtle AUV versus a sea lion AUV? Because at least to me, I do want to preface this with I'm an invertebrate person by trade, so I'm very unused to dealing with anything that has a spine. But it seems to me that like sea lions tend to be more mobile on land. They seem to be more maneuverable, swim faster than sea turtles. What are there any distinct advantages to the sea turtle AUV over the sea lion?
The advantage of the sea turtle is that it's a very steady platform. I mean, the sea lion in its design is very unsteady. Consider your standard airliner, your jet airline plane that you would ride in, compared to a jet fighter plane. The jet fighter plane is actually structured to be unstable, okay? Not to give you a very stable flight. You don't want to take your hands off the controls of a jet airplane because it'll very quickly become unstable. You want that in a jet fighter because you want to be as maneuverable as possible. Whereas you don't want that in your jet airliner because you don't want to shake up all the passengers. So you don't make, very quick turns, anything like that. For the sea turtle, it is a very stable platform. They're slow, they're steady, they can go through the waves, and they can move on to land. Now, granted, not as fast as a sea lion, but there are cases you may want to have a more stable platform. The other thing too is because you have a hard shell as opposed to a flexible body, it may be more easy to construct. And additionally, you could also potentially carry a better payload, well, whatever that may be. Maybe it's tools to assist divers underwater. So you have those, and no one's saying you can't build a robotic sea turtle that swims as fast as a sea lion. Okay, you're not constrained by the biology. So you can mix and match things, and depending again on the particular mission that you have for that particular robot.
Well, thank you. That is not an angle I consider, but that does make a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Frank. Thanks for a great talk. I also had an AUV related question. I was just wondering, and I kind of thought of this specifically with the sea lion AUV, because you have to waterproof this technology, but the flippers also need to be somewhat flexible. And I was wondering what kind of material you made these flippers out of for the AUVs, and follow-up question, do you plan to incorporate tubercles into the other AUVs you mentioned, such as the sea turtle and the sea lion?
Well, it's possible to put the tubercles in. Again, we're not constrained by the biology. Why humpback whales have these tubercles and no other marine mammal really does, just because they have those larger wing-like structures, doesn't, and potentially they have the genes for it, doesn't mean we can't put it into other organisms. And in fact, a paleontology aspect here related to the Mesozoic. During that time, there was a swordfish-like animal during the Mesozoic that had elongate pectoral fins and had bumps on them, or sort of almost a sawtooth. It may have acted in the same way. Let's see. And the other part of your question, I'm trying to remember here. If you could give it to me again.
Yeah, it was pertaining to just what kind of materials you make the flippers out of for the AUVs.
A lot of times it's dragon skin. So this polymer, silicon polymer, is used. I'm not sure for the sea lion in particular. I know for Manthabot that was used, and they've actually have it so they can produce the fin with various stiffnesses. So the stiffness can change along its length, depending upon how they make their mix. So, but I know dragon skin is oftentimes used in these things. For the sea turtle, it's really a foam that is used that we can pneumatically then increase its diameter or decrease it to make a flipper.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Yeah, I have one more question here. You know, you mentioned that a lot of your work is for the military and things like that. So I was just wondering, is it an added benefit to make these robots from military perspective, the fact that they move like animals, does that make them less detectable by, say, other people's technologies?
Well, certainly they'd blend in a bit more in the sea environment.
Yeah.
But you have to be careful about that. And there's several things. So one, you can't have sea lions in, say, the Persian Gulf. It just
Right.
makes no sense at all if you're trying to be not to bring any attention. That would definitely bring attention. The other thing that's interesting, however, is that when we make things that look like marine organisms, potentially there are predators out there that want to eat them. And in one case, we know of a situation in which they built a robotic fish and were testing it in the south, and an alligator came up and bit it. So there are things like that. And even modern submarines are attacked by cookie cutter sharks, and they'll
Okay.
bite into the sort of coating that's on them. So this is another thing we have to watch out for. But yes, we want something that sort of blends in. Sea turtles are found good part through everywhere in the world, except the real high latitudes. Definitely dolphins you find all around. So again, depending upon the mission, depending upon where you're going to operate, you want an organism that will fit in.
Right. Great. I don't see any other questions in the chat or the room. So with that, I'd just like to thank you again. So thank you very much for the excellent talk and for answering questions after. Have a great evening.